So you might say that we have the ontological or metaphysical subject and the empirical subject, and it's very common and easy to confuse these two. So the ontological subject would not really be a subject, but a presencing of the world itself. And this would be a structural feature of the world, that it would come in these ontological subjects that are really just worldings of the world itself, or streamings of the world. So one of these would be what James, in passing, called a personal continuum, and he was stressing what you might call the continuity of such a presencing. And this would be a subject structure, or subject-like substance, but it's not really a substance, given that presence is not a kind of stuff. So at the center of one of these personal continua would be a flesh and blood person. The person would not only be empirical in the sense of having a body, but a locus of responsibility. And this is where Robert Brandam's work would help us. We are responsible for our set of beliefs. We have to explain why we do what we do, say what we say. We are held to a coherence norm. You can sum this up in terms of one is one around here. So psychologically or ethically, the subject is a unity. And this would not only be the unity of the body. So if you look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and some of Wittgenstein's examples, we can play with the idea of two different souls or ethical unities, time sharing in the same body understood as puppet. So just this sci-fi helps us understand, see from the outside the institution of unified selfhood. So when you get a toe tag, there's one name on the toe tag. When you're buried in the graveyard, you get one proper name on the tombstone. So one is one around here, and that one is also the one of Hubert Dreyfus in his book on Heidegger called Being in the World. Okay, so the ontological ego, which is a bit of a misleading name, you might call it witness consciousness, but again, it's not really a stuff. It's a presencing of the world. But what is interesting, the presencing of the world would be structured by the beliefs of the associated empirical or personal ego. So I can use myself as an example. So I'm sitting here in a certain sense at the mobile center of streaming of the world. Now, from my phenomenalistic point of view, what I see is not internal representation, but objects themselves in their full qualitative radiance. But this world has a kind of sense or structure that I can put into words, and I often will put it into words when I represent or pre-present life world situations. And again, the local or intra-worldly application of the picture theory seems appropriate to me, that we do use language to represent and pre-present situations within the life world. But certain ontological statements, structural statements, do not make sense, I think, if understood in terms of representation. And that's why I also embrace a radicalized redundancy theory of truth. So you might say that we live in our beliefs. Now, our beliefs are dynamic, we're constantly updating them, but to say that we update our beliefs is to say that our sense of the world, or the manifestation of the world for us, has changed in its speakable structure. So it seems to me that theories of truth pretend that somehow we can jump out of our own skin, or escape our situatedness as believers. As far as I know, and speaking from experience in my sense of the world, everyone is a situated believer. People have different senses of the world. But when people talk about truth in a kind of strong sense, it just seems to me to involve the projection of an omniscient third-person narrator, which is a theological projection. Now, a person can have a theology or a theological projection, but it should be defended. Or if you're going to just accept a theist point of view, that's fine, but I think one should be explicit about that. Now, if we let go of a user interface, understanding of consciousness as some kind of bubble, right, then what we see in the world, what manifests in the world, would be objects in their full radiance. But the radiance of these objects, I mean, it's going to vary from person to person. This we can discover easily on aesthetic topics, or just like whether someone likes the taste of a food or not. And of course, we know that people can have damage to their sense organs, all kinds of things. But you might say, since the ontological ego is already a presencing of the world itself, or a torrent of naked reality, we don't even need the old-fashioned external world. You could say that Dasein is essentially transcendent, or transcendence itself. Dasein is the disclosure or revelation of the world itself. Now, I try not to lean on Heidegger's jargon too much because that can be off-putting. I don't think we really need to lean on that jargon, but I will say that, yes, he's a huge influence on my thinking. So we don't have the internal and external divide. So this helps us make sense of the object as a cloud of aspects, which would be my updated language, basically, for J.S. Mill's understanding of the object. So we understand ourselves to share a world of objects, but since the object itself manifests in our streams, there's no hidden external object, or you could say that, okay, this same object may manifest differently later or differently to another person. So that's what I mean by cloud of aspects. We associate manifestations, different manifestations with the same object through what you might call a constituting ideality, or the grammar of our language, the form of life. There's no perfect name for this. This would just be a basic structural feature of our existence. It would be presented as relatively universal, and I think maybe this is what Plato was getting at in his esoteric doctrine, that you could say that a personal continuum has a kind of qualitative continuity, but it is sort of discretized or somewhat digital through our taking there to be these enduring entities, and these entities are unities, right? Like the river is the river, and so on. So this is why he would call this digital element, component of reality, the one, and then you would have this qualitative continuum that you might say is always already molested by the digital effect of the one. So what we have, what we live, would be their fusion. But this fusion would be primordial, right? It's only reflection or theoretical postulation that would have us talk of a one and a dyad, or the one and the continuum. And in the same way, you could say that sense data were an invention of philosophers, right? So if you believe in the user interface, then you might try to analyze that user interface in terms of sensation and the concept that organizes it. But the life world, phenomenological life world, you just find meaningful objects, the meaningful life world. And this would help us explain why Mill would talk about objects as something like the continuing interpersonal possibilities of further manifestation. Now, he used the old-fashioned language of sensation, but I think if we read him charitably and try to read between the lines or even enrich his work, steelman his work, then we're talking about enduring possibilities which are fundamentally interpersonal and between us, possibilities of perceptual manifestation, but this perceptual manifestation is also meaningful. Here's where I will bring in my take on Derrida's work. I mean, ultimately, I'll take responsibility for this, but I try to credit. This is at least my creative misreading of Derrida. So once we abandon the idea of the user interface and basically this dualistic idea of an interior and an exterior, we sort of lose pure meaning, the idea of a pure meaning that is kind of ethereal, utterly non-material. And we also lose the idea of stuff that is utterly meaningless, which you might call the clay of the primal plenum, the unformed matter and then form. These would be understood maybe in a traditional notion of design as separable, and then like a spoken word would be something like this pure meaning that somehow catches a ride on a sonic vehicle. Even the etymology of the word translate suggests something like a passenger jumping out of one car and jumping into another car. So I would say this is a useful metaphor, but a misleading metaphor. To paraphrase or to translate, I think, is to create another sounding or another inscription that we can judge to be roughly equivalent in their effect or value in the total life world context. There's no fundamental gulf between the lecture of a philosopher, the hiss of a cat, and maybe a train roaring down the tracks. We might speak of a varying intensity of significance, and we might therefore understand the use of the word sign to point out especially radiant objects, especially if the radiance is obviously associated with an arbitrary convention. You might say that representational realism or indirect realism took a knife and cut the world in half into an internal and an external, and this kind of phenomenalist view glues the world back together. But it does have to acknowledge from a point of viewness, and that is how we get a cloud of aspects. I feel like this is maybe what tempted people to to do subjective idealism in the first place, and of course indirect realism really does take some of subjective idealism and then glue on an external world that is articulated by a third-person narrator, but it still puts people in bubbles, and they would understand the ontological ego as a consciousness stuff that is radically other than an external stuff. It would depend on this external stuff. Now, another thing that would motivate indirect realism is the undeniable functional relationships between the manifestation of the world, between a streaming of the world and the state of the body of the associated so-called experiencer. So I've already mentioned that Mach already dealt with this in a way that is very different from Descartes and Locke. We don't have to read these functional relationships in terms of a user-face interior and some radically external true world that is implicitly articulated by an omniscient narrator if we want to hold on to truth as correspondence. And, finally, I'll get to that issue. Like science, it's the pursuit of warranted belief. I think belief is always situated, but situated believers can come together to try to be less stupid by enacting what Popper called a second-order tradition of belief management. And you might say that this tradition would be organized by a meta-belief, which is still a belief, that there's a good way to handle beliefs and let beliefs do our dying for us. And this would be a belief that it is good to discuss beliefs, criticize beliefs, and to try to improve beliefs. So in a certain sense, this is a dynamic conception of the self, where instead of identifying with your particular first-order beliefs, you identify with the second-order meta-belief or the second-order tradition. And you become a kind of vortex of first-order beliefs, and you can afford to let your first-order beliefs die for you. Now, if we let go of the projection of a third-person omniscient narrator, and if we've let go of the user interface, then the ambiguity of the world is genuine in a certain sense. It's not only a kind of user illusion. The world really is sort of unsettled, ambiguous. And it's seen from many different points of view, or you could say it even radiates or exists implicitly from many points of view. And it's worth noting that this from a point of viewness is basically implicit in the aspect. The object given as aspect implies, if you will, a point of view. But this subjective element is sort of in the radiance of the so-called external. Now, for humans, this is really complicated because we do use signs, which are, themselves clouds of aspects, basically empirical objects that somehow represent or pre-present life world situations. And because the self is a kind of locus of responsibility that is a time-binding unity, you might say that we have an intense self-consciousness, and we have signs that refer to signs, and this virtual entity of the self, which is genuine in the sense that really all entities are virtual to the degree that their substance is merely logical. But you can see how we do have what you might call rich inner lives. But again, following Derrida, even the internal monologue is basically imagined or remembered speech acts that have a qualitative manifestation, even if it's minimal and relatively concealable. So I think the thing that's most counterintuitive about this view is the thing that comes up in Meillassoux Against Finitude. What do we make about scientific claims that refer to objects that preceded what we understand to be the emergence of sentience? So I think that empirical claims are ultimately about the future. So this is even in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. If you discuss things that in the past in a scientific way, they're empirical claims if their placement there in the causal nexus can be verified in the positivist language, or at least somewhat confirmed by their implications in terms of possible perceptions. Far more intuitively, it's more like a conditional statement. Like we could even talk about the birth of our mother. We believe that there was perceptual presence, but that perceptual presence is no more. So we have what you might call the signative presence of a perceptual presence that is no more. And we could just, I guess the best we can do about the past is sort of conditionally imagine that if we could get in a time machine or just somehow be there, things would be like they would be if somehow our mother could be born before us now, which is of course impossible. So J.S. Mill, he kind of tackles this when he talks about the existence of Calcutta in his book on Hamilton's philosophy. So to me, this isn't, I mean, it's not going to obviously just satisfy everyone. So it's definitely a thorny issue. But I think the other side, as I mentioned in my video on Meillassoux, also have serious problems in trying to account for this radically external world outside of the user interface. Like, what kind of being would they say that it has? And then it seems to me that Meillassoux is trying to repeat John Locke. So, you know, does the user interface get primary properties right? And for him, they're mathematizable properties. But of course, scientific theories are tentative. And since you can't peer around the user interface, you kind of have primary qualities that are indefinitely defined in principle. And there's the issue of, you know, for Meillassoux, you know, the math somehow captures the primary qualities, but the primary qualities are not really mathematical. So I think that the existence of presentience objects is even more elusive and questionable on the other side. So I would say that this is just, the past is a weird thing to think about.